Welcome to Rev Reads. I am thrilled to have you here as we have not another author interview, but we're discussing J.N. Darby and the latest Darby biography by Max Weremchuk called Becoming JND with Brian Reynolds. And Brian is a man after Darby's own heart because when I asked him how to introduce himself, he's like, I'm Brian Reynolds of Nova Scotia, which I'm sure if you asked Darby how to introduce himself, most of his ministry, he probably would have been like, I'm just JN Darby, and not gone with any of the titles or anything like that. But Brian's here to talk with us a little bit about Darby, what you can get from Max's book, what he learned about it. So let's start off, Brian, with telling the people who are watching a little bit about your knowledge base when it comes to JN Darby.
Yeah, well, Shawn, I just confess right up front, I'm not a scholar. I'm an itinerant Bible preacher. I'm not a scholar. Although I have this claim to fame. I did visit the John Rylands Library, Manchester University. That I know both Max Weremchuk and Crawford Gribben, they haunt the halls over there, but my they have a whole Brethren archive there. But my claim to fame was I would just, I would take Mr. Darby's, wide margin Bible off the shelf and look at it and say, wow, look. But those guys, they're serious scholars. They spend days there, as you can see from Max's book, digging into the details and so on. But with me, it's really experiential. Like Darby's ministry is actual written ministry revolutionized my Christian life and understanding. And I've read all 34 volumes of his collected writings, his five-volume synopsis of the Bible several times, his 3-volume letters, which, by the way, I recommend to you sometime for your show here. But and so on. And, so I feel I know the man and I know the doctrine and I've appreciated it. So that's really where I come from. It's impact upon me, experientially, personally. I was saved in the Jesus revival in the late 60s, early 70s out in the West Coast Canada and British Columbia, baptized by the Jesus people in the Okanagan Lake, so then I was mildly, charismatic. And my wife and I, we ended up in the Pentecostal church for 10 years. And where, of course, you can lose your salvation was taught and so on. And through various means, not to go into details, I came into contact with the writings of a lot of the early brethren, not just Darby, but, Sage McIntosh, William Kelly, F.W. Grant, Harry Ironside, all these guys. And I started reading them, and it was just like, where have I been? And the assurance of salvation, my link with Christ in glory, the hope of the Lord's coming. Although I always believed the Lord's could come at any time, but they articulated it in a way that really made sense to me. And so that's really where I come from. So my thing is I'm not promoting a man or promoting J.N. Darby, but the teachings that came out at that period of time in church history have had a huge influence on the church in a positive way, in my opinion, right? And spread further than and deeper than I think is commonly realized.
Yeah, one of the cool things, I guess, about what you're doing, Brian, with traveling around doing a sort of itinerant ministry with, brethren assemblies, is you're kind of living out what a lot of Darby's actual ministry was during his years. So you're sort of, putting the shoes on today of a 21st century Darby. And so I'm excited to hear your opinions about the book and sort of your feelings about it. So I wonder if we could just start off first, if somebody doesn't know about this latest Darby biography, which there are so few books out available at all about the man's life. What do you think people should expect to find when they dive into Max's pretty thick here, Becoming JND?
Well, lots of pages, 700. But like on Jane Darby's gravestone in Bournemouth, England, there's a quotation from Corinthians, well known yet unknown. And is well known in the sense that a lot of Bible believing Christians believe a lot of the doctrines that were brought out at that time, but they've never heard of the guy, right? That was one of the guys, the main guys, that was instrumental of the vessel that the Lord used. In this book, it's a little bit different because it covers the years, his birth, 1800 up to 1829. But really, before, say, 1826, 1827, at least on the doctrinal side, there's not a lot of information. And so what Max has done is, and he has the patience of a scholar to do this, is to, go through the culture of the day, especially in the schooling system of Britain, 19th century Britain, and all the details, and their legal system, because Darby studied to be a lawyer first before he became an Anglican priest. And so he goes into all this detail. And that may not be for some, You had to be a real Darby connoisseur if you want to wade through it, But, I found it interesting. I really like the doctrinal aspect, which comes more out at the end, and that's why I like Crawford's book particularly, the Roots of Dispensationalism, Crawford Gribben. But I believe Max's book is an important addition. It has a place because of all this background information. At least it gives the setting. The thing is, Shawn, and you've probably picked this up, it's not just it's not just JND, it's just not Darby. There was the Christian atmosphere at the time in Great Britain, that early period of the 19th century. There was a whole lot of believers that were starting to wake up to things, especially connected to the Lord's coming.
Yeah.
And he sort of rose to be sort of the main instrument in that, but he wasn't alone. There was a whole background here that maybe we can discuss, but of really learned, accomplished people in the elite of Anglicanism. And that's the funny thing, the strange thing is that, it didn't come from the Presbyterians or the Baptists or whoever first, or Independents, whatever, but of all places, the Anglican Church. That's one of the things that really miffed, going back even earlier period of time into the Great Awakening, with Charles Wesley and, and George Whitefield. That really miffed, guys like some of the Congregationalist guys like Isaac Watts and that. It's like, God, why would you use an Anglican to start the Bible? Well, he uses whom he will, because George Whitefield and John Wesley, they were, dyed-in-the-wool Anglicans, and God started the revival there in the Anglican Church. And so we get this repeat. Another interesting fact in this regard is that the different eschatologies that we now all, talk about, discuss, and debate, like dispensationalism, premillennialism, dispensationalism, and all of this postmillennialism really are all post-Reformation, right? The charge is dispensationalism is new, but they're all relatively new. Even amillennialism, because although it's Roman Catholic, it was never really developed. It was sort of de facto. The church is the kingdom and the discussion. But these eschatologies, because first you had to have the Bible, in the hands of the people, and then the doctrine of justification by faith. And then these other things, Christians had to wrestle through. Like, what do we believe about the Lord's coming? Or what is the church? Or what is salvation in the deeper aspect of it? So the Reformation was the ground zero, right? And then everything follows from that. I don't know how I got off on that tangent, but
well, I mean, I think we're just showing that what this book does more so than show how Darby's doctrine developed, which only comes up toward the end of the book, but it's more how Darby developed. It's the world that he grew up in. And so in some ways you do have to have a little bit of interest in learning about Ireland and England in the early 19th century. And if you enjoy reading about that, which I found a lot of it fascinating. Like there's a bunch of times going up my wife being like, did you know that they lived this way? Did you know they did this? And telling her about all these things, but it's not so much, that doctrinal stuff, which will come later. It seems to me like this should definitely be a part 1.
That was my thought. I didn't ask Masks, but maybe this is volume 1, and that volume 2 will have like the mid-years or something like this. I don't know. Because
there's some things in this book that I would love to know if in Max's mind pays off later in the story. Like there are things that that Darby develops in his doctrine or his thinking, and Max is able to be like, well, look at what what he went through here, or what the world is involved with there. So I don't know if he'll end up doing that later in another volume, but that would be where it would be.
I had the same sort of impression or thought. I don't know if it's right, but you see these guys like in the schooling system. In one way, their schooling system was sort of weird.
Oh, totally bizarre.
Especially the law, like they have these brawls and fist fights, were part of the curriculum. What's the story on that? But but on the other hand, they were in what we would call even, junior or like junior high level or whatever. They're studying Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. They're writing their papers in Latin. They're writing their papers in Greek. At very early age of life, not advanced, not on a doctorate, what we would call a doctorate level, but much earlier, so.
Well, then the bizarre, they're learning Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. They got to memorize those languages, be able to repeat it, translate the Greek New Testament, but they can't make change. They don't know how to make basic pocket change because they don't learn any math whatsoever. So it's really cool stuff to learn. I enjoyed reading about it all throughout. Was there anything in the book that made you be like, I didn't realize this about Darby, or I'm going to view him a little bit different now because of learning that in early information?
Not really. I'm so familiar with, having read all the biographies over the years that have been made available, some good, maybe not, some not so good, and knowing the man himself, because like I mentioned his 3-volume letters, right? There's three volumes, each about 300 pages. And a lot of the information that we know, his personal information, actually comes from him. Although he's not writing a biography, it's by the way, it comes out by the way when he's talking to someone. And very, very, very helpful if you really want to get into it. Starts in 1828. Really, that's when his ministry begins. The first letter in 1828, the last letter is in 1882 when he died. And so all his travels, and people would write him questions about doctrinal issues and stuff, and so you get all the responses. So it's interesting. No, so to answer your question, like I didn't really learn anything new, particularly on Darby himself. I did learn, like, they had fist fights in law school, you know what I mean? But, and all that was interesting, and the situation in Ireland and England, I'm somewhat familiar with that, with the history, the British did everything possibly wrong that they could possibly do to push the Irish away, but that's all water under the bridge now, I guess. But, it's sort of a rough history. I mean, that goes right back to Oliver Cromwell and, burning down Irish villages because they wouldn't confess that the Pope is the Antichrist or something, and you see the post-millennialism there coming to bear.
Oh, totally, yeah.
Right? Because if Joshua burnt down the Canaanites village, we can burn down the Irish villages. They see no distinction, no dispensational distinction. So these things are all important, aren't they? Our eschatological view colors everything.
Oh, I felt like the Anglican treatment of the Irish must have had a profound impact on Darby's ecclesiology. Like, I think it must have had a huge impact on just his desire for unity in the church, because it wasn't just that the church was separate, but it was they treated each other like garbage. And I think that must have really impacted the way that the reason he wanted to break down all those barriers and why they start the Brethren movement.
There's this sort of disconnect or this strange situation where a lot of the people that Darby associated with were the elite, British elite, who ruled Ireland, right? And they were tenant landlords, a lot of, and you had these poor Irish who worked their little potato farms and stuff. And when I say poor, like I mean poor, like we don't have poor in North America compared to what these people experience. And Darby, like when he was the Anglican priest, like he literally lived among them, right? And traveled amongst them and lived amongst them, trying to bring them the gospel, as such as he had at the time, because he himself, his first 6 years, he was like in Romans 7 under the law, until like 1827 when he had his riding accident. He was set aside and that opened up a whole new vista of things scripturally for him. But in the light that he had, he was devoted in his service to them. And I think they appreciated that, where a lot of the others, they wanted to bring them evangelical truth, but there might have been method and some ulterior motives in some of that as well. So it's really
Brian. I was wondering if you could. Sorry about interrupting. I just wonder if you could just speak for a moment on something you just said in passing. Maybe for those who are watching, could you say? Tell us what the accident is that Darby had and why that ended up having such a profound impact on him.
Right. Well, he was, he would go back and forth early in the morning, late at night amongst these poor Irish Catholics, bringing them the gospel and praying with them and so on. And one time he was out between 1826 and 1827, and his horse threw him up against a fence or a post and crushed his leg or his knee. And so he was set aside, and he went. I think he was staying with the Penn Fathers. He was related to them. Who was the Lord Chief Justice of Ireland. There was a family relation connection with them, but he was also spiritually coming to a crisis point within himself, where he was very much under the law. Romans 7. He said. One place he said he read Psalm 88. If you want to read Psalm 88 afterwards, it's pretty dark, but the fact that a saint wrote it gave him hope that there was still hope for him, so no assurance of salvation, but really believing in the Lord Jesus, believing in the Orthodox doctrine, believing that Jesus died for him, but no assurance of salvation. And then when he was set aside, he began to really get into the Word of God. And the first thing was that, can I trust the Word of God? Absolutely. That if even in heaven and earth disappeared, that the Word of God would still stand. And he came to that conviction that the Word of God is the Word of God, and he could trust it with everything. Well, that was the first thing. But in the development of his spiritual life in these studies, the first thing was he realized was his connection with Christ, his union with Christ, that not only that Jesus died for our sins, but he ascended to heaven, and by the Spirit we are connected with him. We have a union with him, and therefore, it's not just that my sins past are forgiven, but that all my sins, that when Christ died on the cross, all my sins were future, and that it was a finished work. For example, like in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where Paul says there that he who is joined to the Lord is one spirit with him. Verses like that connection with the Lord. Or verse 15 of 1 Corinthians 6, do you not know that your bodies are the members of Christ? Not just that we are members of the body of Christ, but that our actual bodies are Christ's members. We're literally his body. It's just not a theological theory, but an actual divine reality. And so when Paul was converted, Saul of Tarsus was converted, the Lord said, Saul, Saul, Why do you persecute me? You know, so in touching the saints, you're touching him. So this close link with Christ. And so JD, he extrapolated from that. If I have that perfect union with Christ, that other believers do, and so the church is one body, right, destined for glory. So the truth of the Lord's coming actually comes out of, first, like you might say, the ecclesiastical truth that was recovered to him, and the gospel of God's grace truth that came out to him at that time. So those 2 years between, let's say, 1827 and 1828, this was all happening when he was set aside.
So before he's set aside, one thing I found, I guess what I found most interesting reading this book was that Darby, he grows up fairly wealthy.
Yeah.
He's going to upper level schools, and his family's, it's got money. And that he becomes so impoverished and is working with the Irish that they actually, like, people give him charity because they think, like, oh man, look at how destitute this man looks because he's working with the poor Irish all the time. And that was sort of the most unexpected thing to me. Was there anything that in the book that just kind of struck you about his world or his upbringing that you saw in there that you didn't expect to see?
No, I can't say actually so, but there were things in the book that I, was not familiar with, or at least had not read before, but more in some of the appendices, a lot of helpful information there, like the letter of his congregants, the Irish group there in Calgary that wrote him after he left, and their sort of their farewell letter, and a few other things like that were very interesting. It was sort of new to me. I knew that there was a letter, but I never read it. And there's several other things along that line. Lacunza's comments on Isaiah 32 are very interesting. Like, I heard about Emanuel Lacunza and his influence on not just Darby, but a lot of the Christians of that period. That was interesting as well. And they actually have, Max has in the appendix his doctrine, Lacunza's doctrine or teaching on Isaiah 32, which actually had an impact on JND and some of the others.
So speaking of the appendix, the book itself, the story, the biography is 366 pages. Mm-hmm. And by the time you get to the end of the contents, it is 709 pages. Yeah. So any thoughts about the worthwhileness of the appendices and the bibliography and so forth?
Absolutely. The appendices and the endnotes are worth the price of the book, in my opinion, and very helpful. Max said, he probably told you too, like a lot of the endnotes and stuff in the appendix would have been in the main volume of the book, but the publishers talked them out of it because it would have been too thick, but very, very helpful, and just adds to the general information that we have about Darby for those who want to study him. I think really helpful. And again, I was struck with this Emanuel Lacunza, this Jesuit priest, because if you look up, if you Google J and Darby, you'll get this whole spiel that he was a Jesuit priest. Right? So, in other words, that the doctrine of the rapture is a Jesuit trick, right? Okay. A Jesuit conspiracy to corrupt the church. All this sort of crazy stuff, But Emanuel Lacunza was a Jesuit priest. He was born in Chile, and he, I think he immigrated to Italy. He wrote this book, The Coming of the Messiah and His Majesty and Glory. And basically, he was promoting premillennial teaching. I think his thesis was to show that the Pope was not the Antichrist, because that was the teaching in the Reformation. It still is, but the Pope is the Antichrist. Okay, so and he wanted to try to prove that he wasn't. But when you read his stuff, like he was premillennial but he thought the Antichrist was a system. But he believed that the Jews would come back on the earth, and so this was in the air at this time, because Edward Irving, the leader of the Irvingites, he had translated the book from Italian or whatever original language is written in, and so that was being circulated. And Isaiah 32 had an impact on Darby as well. Of all chapters of the Bible, like when it comes to the millennium and the rapture, there are two passages that really helped him in his understanding. And so one was Isaiah 32, and the other was 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. I mean, I can read you Darby's quotes about those, but like I said, that was in the air, and so all this was circulating at the time.
So it was a Jesuit priest who was trying to defend the Pope, who writes about premillennialism, and I'm going to guess he has a future view of Revelation.
Absolutely, and that the 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week are
really happen.
Literal, and there will be literal millennium, and God will restore the Jews, and so because he started reading the Bible, this Emanuel Luna, this is a crazy thing, isn't that a strange thing, Shawn? Is that the Lord has His people in the weirdest places and in the weirdest positions, because I had no doubt that the guy was a believer. But it's hard, but he was in the 1700s. He lived in the 1700s, and Irving translated his book. So it was circulating amongst the Anglicans, the evangelical Anglicans at the time. And
well, I mean, one thing Crawford Gribben, I don't know if he wrote about it or we talked about it in the interview, is that nowadays we have, if you're dispensational, you're premillennial. If you're a Presbyterian, you're, post-mill, on-mill. And like we separate people into these camps typically that are broader things. And Gribben is more like, back then, at that point in history, eschatology was kind of a free-for-all.
Yeah.
Anybody could be pre-mill, anybody could be post-mill, anybody could be on-mill. It was in no way connected to your larger systematic theology, and they were more like they were okay with it. Like people weren't really bothered by Darby's eschatology because there were other people in your group that would have had similar eschatology to Darby.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. But on the other hand, the sectarian positions of denominational structures, the barriers were very strict. Although you can believe anything you want in your denomination, but don't have anything to do with those guys in that denomination, right? So, and that's what grieved the heart of like Darby and the other guys. And like even Dr. Cronin, he's mentioned in the book here. I think he's mentioned also in the appendix, but Crawford probably mentions him too. This Dr. Cronin, I think he was a dentist, and he had been a Roman Catholic, was converted and so on. And he was at some dissenting church. And then he said, they made you join our church, you have to separate from all other churches and this type of thing. So like it grieved his heart, so much so that like on Lord's Day, he would hide in the hayloft because you wouldn't want to be seen outside your church and not going to church, right? At that time, but the culture, right? And he was one of the first ones, Cronin with Darby and some others that began just breaking bread just as believers, But these things become hardened over time, and we build again the things we once destroyed, like Paul says in Galatians. So it's really hard to avoid. But I like what JND once said: to have a narrow path for your feet, but a large heart for all the saints, right? And that always spoke to me because we are chopped up. Pretty aggressively, but the Lord's own are His own. His sheep are His sheep. There is one body. That's all there is, right? One head, one body, one spirit.
So here's my one question. We'll put it right sort of maybe in the middle, depending on how long this is going to be, as far as what might be like, controversial about the book. Any major areas of disagreement with anything that Max wrote? Did he write anything where you were like, I don't think you got that there.
Yeah, I would say not in his facts. His facts are right on, right? And he's a really good scholar in that way. Like, and it's all footnoted, and all the facts are there. And I'm not going to use the word agenda because that's a little too strong. His thesis, okay, that's probably a better word. His thesis. All these scholars have a thesis. You know, they don't write a book just to write a book. They're trying to say something. But my impression was part of what Max is trying to show is sometimes Darby was not always accurate in his remembrances or his statements.
Which, that came up many times in the book.
Yeah, and you know, they didn't have iPhone. You know, you get your Google tells you what you did in 2014. You know, so you know, I get that. I accept that possibility. Yeah. But maybe the implication a little that there was sort of some method in Darby's madness in not remembering things correctly. Or one example came to my mind was the conversion of J.C. Philpott. Okay, J.C. Philpott, who I think he was for a while a tutor at the Penn Fathers, which was again the relations to Darby, and he fell in love with one of their daughters, and that sort of fell through, and he was really depressed, right? And it was through that experience that he cried out to the Lord and he became a believer. But in Darby's letters, he said that the Lord had used him to lead Philpott, who became the leader of the strict Baptists, the closed Baptists in Britain, you know, the Gospel Standard Trust group. So Darby says he was the instrument the Lord used to lead him to Christ. Okay, so what Max says is, well, we have JND's statement that he led him to Christ, but Philpott himself just describes this period of depression, this sorrow, and it doesn't mention Darby. So therefore, the conclusion is that maybe Darby's exaggerating or making up the fact that and I don't see that at all. I just see that Philpott was just describing his, you know, what happened to him when he came to Christ. And it's very, it seems, you know, normal to me, the fact that Darby was in and out of the Penn Fathers all the time, that he would be there one time and one occasion when this man was going through this period. And maybe he counseled him and he showed him the way of salvation. I can't see that Darby, he would have no motive to lie about it, you know, to say or to exaggerate it. He did. In fact, he just writes about it offhandedly. He doesn't make a big point of it, Darby, that he led this fellow to the Lord. So what I feel that Max was suggesting a little, trying to read between the line there, that this is another example that maybe he would make things up sometimes. Like for me, to know the guy, like when you read his ministry and his books, to suggest that he would do something that I just don't see it. I just say it's just that we don't have all the facts. Okay, and
is there a common accusation against Darby that he made things up? Because I felt like maybe reading between the lines that maybe Max was, you know, trying to lean into what was a common assumption that Darby would make.
Some have said there's been different views on like the beginnings of brethren, like who are the first ones to meet different brothers and stuff like that. And Darby has his view of this. But again, you know, it's probably hard for them to remember back in their early years of who met where, when, you know. Yeah. But I think Max seems to make a point of it a bit through the book, a little bit.
Oh, he does.
Yeah. So, and I'm not saying that Darby was perfect in his memory. But that one thing with Philpott, the leader who would become the leader of the strict Baptists in the UK, you know, I think he, you know, he just my opinion, no offense, you know, that he may have stepped.
That's why I'm asking you to give your opinion.
I'm Canadian, you know, I don't want to offend.
Oh, that's right. I forgot. Don't ask the Canadian to come on when you want controversy.
Yeah, right. No, I'm sorry. I don't want to. No, I feel. You know, that sort of grated me a little bit, to be honest with you, you know, and I don't think it's probably actual. and is reading too much in it. So there's that little bit of it. So that's his thesis a little bit. But I have to say, in all fairness to Max, for example, Atkinson, another biographer of Darby, he's brutal. It's an attack. His whole book's an attack. And Max defends Darby when he's dishonestly attacked like that several times in his book, like mostly in his endnotes and so on.
Yeah.
Where Atkinson says this, Max will defend him. So Max's criticisms are not egregious as Atkinson's, in my opinion. So I'll give that to Max. But that, apart from that, though, I mean, factually, it's an accurate book when it comes to the events, the dates he gives, and all of this. And I think it's really a valuable addition to the study of the life of Darby and of that time period and what was happening with the Christians in the UK at that time.
I'm just trying to remember, and it's bothering me that I can't off the top of my head. Philpott, was his depression the one that was caused because he fell in love with the Pennefather's daughter?
Yep.
And they thought that he wasn't good enough for her, so they sent her out of the country till he was gone.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, that was like, I felt like that was like an ice cold move that you'd see in a Jane Austen book.
Yeah, right. You get this Jane Austen vibe, when when you read this,
No, Darby lived in her world for sure. No, I told my wife a couple of times, I was like, you would probably like this book more than you think you would.
Have you ever been to
reading about the world back then?
Have you been to the UK?
I've not been to the UK.
Okay, like I've probably been 8 or 9 times, the Bible conference of it. And sometimes when you have time off, you visit these old estate castles, right? Like they're not actually lived in anymore by people. A lot of them. Some are. They'll have a little compartment there where they live in. But their estate, in other words, the government of the UK keeps them up, and they're run by foundations. People give donations, like Downton Abbey, although I think actual family lives in that one. So you go to these, and they want to keep them as part of their heritage. And when you're in there, it's just you're back, and you're like you're back in Max's book. It was a real its own culture, its own time, but just amazing. It was at that time period that the things that we hold as, premillennialists, dispensationalists came out at that time period, and the other striking oddity about this is that the premillennial hope, the rapture and so on in Europe, in the UK, but even more so in continental Europe, never really left the meeting halls of the brethren.
Yeah.
But in North America, exploded amongst the evangelical churches generally, and still is today. Which is,
do you think there's a reason? Do you have any theories as to why?
I don't know. There's something in the American DNA. I don't know what it is. But that's a well-known. I mean, we can be thankful for it.
Oh no, I am thankful for it. I was just wondering if you had a good theory as to why, because I
don't. When you read through Darby's letters, his trips to, and that's another valuable thing about this book is the timeline. Okay, of course, this timeline only goes up to 1829. The timeline is very helpful, but
the timeline's great, which is part of the reason why I'd love another volume. You want to keep that timeline.
Maybe that will come,
Yeah.
But in the early 1860s, Darby came to Canada and the U.S. and he traveled around, mostly amongst the Presbyterians, like the Calvinist Reform, group. So he. In one of his letters, he says there that when he first came to America, hardly any evangelicals had the assurance of salvation. Yeah. And part of this awakening, like there was a revival in England and the States in Canada in the 1850s, like an evangelical revival. And then coming out of that, like you had D.L. Moody and all of this happening, Like when Darby says about Moody, when he first met him, he was mostly preaching works. Okay, so he got them into contact with a lot of the Brethren's writings, not just Darby's. Like they unbelievably huge amount of pamphlets, booklets, and books came over the ocean, spread through these churches, right? With the all sufficiency of the work of Christ, like Mackintosh's notes on the Pentateuch and his miscellaneous writings, for example, and all of these it was just massive, and it had a huge impact on guys like Moody and J.H. Brooks and all of these fellows, and so it had a big impact, not just the hope of the rapture, but a lot of the things that we hold now as believers, in the full assurance of salvation, all that, really came out at that time. And, so we could be thankful. Why America? I don't know particularly why.
So speaking of America, I think one of the things I appreciate the most about Darby after reading Becoming JND and Roots of Dispensationalism is, even though I think a lot of things his view on the church I think could be kind of unworkable, I do like his overall views on the church and its relation to politics and government. And right now, I mean, politics are about as hot button an issue as you can get, especially in light of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. Right. In fact, I saw on Twitter yesterday, somebody said, if your pastor mentioned the assassination on Sunday, look for another church. And the top comment on that comment was, if your pastor didn't mention the assassination on Sunday, look for another church. What do you think Darby's advice would be for North American Christians right now when it comes to the church and politics? How do you think he would speak to this?
I know exactly what he would say.
Okay, let's get
exactly what I think. Stay as far away from it as possible. But I can read you a quote from his letters here.
Yeah, let's take it.
1866, one of his early trips to the U.S. Okay, and he's describing what he finds in the U.S. Okay, so he says, the condition of the state spiritually, indeed, every way except money making, is frightful. Okay. The common course for Christians is to go to balls and enter fiercely into politics, though there are exceptions. Assassinations are of a daily occurrence in the large towns, so that the newspapers do not even put them in unless they are of some special circumstance. With gunslingers and assassinations, political assassinations, and so on. That is another part of the DNA of America too. Right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You can go right down the list, right? But and then he goes on. He says, but they've had enough of it, and they would probably would be a war again. This is, I think, just the Civil War was just coming to an end. He and a coworker was giving out tracts and preaching to the soldiers who were going into the battle during the Civil War, right? He says, but I do not expect it, that they would have another Civil War, is what he's saying, because they had enough of the first one, so they probably wouldn't have another one right now, basically.
You never know.
They're just sort of sick of it right now. They have too recently felt what it is, but all this confusion and ill feeling, thank God I passed through as a stranger and a pilgrim, and meet sincere kindness and opportunities of work for myself, and have only been thankful for what I have met with. But basically, no. Well, there's two ways we can look at this when it comes to the question of Darby and the politics and everything. First, and what he found when he came to the U.S. is first just culturally from where he came from. You've read this, right? So to come to America, it's coming like to the chaos and the Wild West, like culturally speaking, and he was like a conservative, like a Tory, like conservative by nature. But when we think conservative, don't think like conservative in modern U.S. terms, but conservative in the sense of tradition, right? like a monarchist, not a Republican. Like republicanism would be like, just great against them, like the whole democratic. So that's the cultural side would probably have grated upon him a bit. But spiritually, like biblically, he believed that as Christians, we have to be, as pilgrims, separate from these things. And I know today, when we say that, they charge us with being Anabaptists and all this type of thinking, right? But where the push is coming from, Shawn, the push is coming from the postmillennialists and this resurgence, and I think a lot of dispensationalists get swept up in it, and lose their roots where what our calling is. I'm not saying a person can't vote or whatever, but once you get involved in the partisanship, like it affects the spirit. It affects the spirit, and that's what Darby was warning against. I know some of the old brethren I meet, they say this when it comes to politics: our man is in. Our man is in. He's at the right hand of God. But I know people can make arguments about civic involvement and all that. I just leave that with them. But he would be dead. He would be dead against it. But I was just stayed with a family in Chicago last week. They're Egyptian. A family immigrated to the U.S. There are a lot of brethren assemblies in Egypt, hundreds of them, and big assemblies. I mean, they live in an Islamic culture, right? So sometimes we get sort of like in North America, we get, the rest of the world is not like us. Like for the Christians, it's totally different, right? And they live in an Islamic culture. If they want to get the roof of their meeting hall repaired, they have the right, all sorts of fill all sorts of bureaucratic forms, hand it to the official, and maybe 25 years later they might be able to get it done. This type of thing, this low level of persecution, right? So a lot of our brethren around the world, suffered that. So we're thankful, but so the argument can be made, for civic involvement, but he was very, very wary of it, and what it does to the church and what it does to our spirit. So he would be opposed to it for sure, not only culturally, but from a biblical perspective.
So last year I read this book. I don't know if you can see it here, Fundamentalists in the Public Square by Madison Trammell. Mm-hmm. And so Trammell writes about how the key traits of fundamentalism in the last century, and fundamentalists were almost exclusively, they're mostly dispensationalists. Was that you were against evolution being taught in the public school. You were all about prohibition, and then cultural wars, other similar cultural wars. So have we been off of Darby's focus then for like 100 years, basically?
Mm-hmm. Again, it may be part of the American cultural backdrop of the type of government, every man's individual right and this type of thing may have influenced that. But just take prohibition for an example. Prohibition is a good example. Okay, prohibition, you outlaw. The Christians are very much involved with that, right?
Yeah.
And they would vote for congressmen, who congressmen don't care. They were probably drinking behind the scenes. Right? You know how politicians are. They use you, right? They use the church, and that's the other danger too. The church becomes, sort of like the harlot. It gets used. But so they vote. You had Billy Sunday preaching against booze, in the 1930s. Okay, so booze is outlawed. Right? You can't go to a liquor store. You can't buy it in a restaurant. But you can go to speakeasy, and Al Capone will get you all sorts of rum that you want. Rum running gave rise to gangsterism.
Oh yeah.
Right. So just as many people were drinking and boozing after Prohibition is for Prohibition, with the added effect of gangsterism on top of it, because there's no government control. So you cannot legislate out the flesh.
Like, I wish you could. I wish you could.
Wrong. Yeah, you wish you could. Well, the Lord Jesus is going to do it, Shawn.
That's true. That's true.
Right? There's a really good verse along that line in Isaiah chapter 26, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
I
sure.
don't want to stretch out your podcast too much, but Isaiah chapter 26, where it says in verse 9, "For when your judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world will learn righteousness." See, the inhabitants of the world will not learn righteousness through the gospel. Like there will be no change except for those who accept the gospel. Yeah. Hopefully there's a change in the life and they'll learn righteousness. But the world, the nations, will only learn righteousness when God's judgments are in the earth. Isaiah goes on to say, "Let grace be shown to the wicked, yet he will not learn righteousness. In the land of uprightness, he will deal unjustly." So even when you have the best of conditions, prosperity, freedom, everything, no one's happy, right?
No. We are more miserable and afraid than we've ever been before.
Like, let's start a civil war. Why? I don't know, because I hate those other guys, they're evil, so that's just man's nature, right? So the Lord's going to put an end to it with his iron rod, when he rules from Zion, and he'll smash those potter vessels into dust. That's when righteousness will reign, and not until then.
Which then plays into Darby's ruin of the church view of ecclesiology. Then, it's not the church that will succeed in the end.
Right. Well, the ruin of the church theology is not that the Lord Jesus will fail in building his assembly. That will, go on and will be taken up in the rapture. But it's like the outward testimony and all the mix and everything with it. It's a disaster.
Oh yeah,
it's a disaster. I think there was I've forgotten the name of the historian, and he was speaking of Christendom, not evangelicalism. But he said, the annals, that is the history, the annals of Christendom are the annals of hell. And it's true. It's a history of hell. It's nothing to be proud of. And so if the Christian nationalists come to power, everything's going to be hunky-dory, right? It's all going to be love, joy, and peace.
No, I think we clearly see with what happened with the Roman Catholic Irish, with the Anglicans, that
exactly.
The church gets that kind of power. Yeah. It's going to destroy people.
Jeremy Howard, Jeremy?
I've watched his Do Theology podcast.
He's done the series lately on Christian National, which I think was pretty good, and he goes into some of these details. But yeah. So
I was wondering if you had any opinions that you could share with us on Crawford Gribben's book, then, Roots of Dispensationalism.
Well, Crawford, of course, is a totally different type of book.
Yeah.
It's really looking at the doctrine. Now, with Crawford's book, I basically agree with everything. His not agenda, his thesis, is that Darby's doctrine is quite distinct and far removed from modern dispensationalism.
Yes.
Where I would disagree a little with Crawford on this, in that J and Darby's doctrine is not so far removed from classical dispensationalism up to and including, Louis Sperry Schaeffer, Schofield, and those guys. The doctrine is very close. In fact, Walter Scott was one of the guys who worked on the Scofield Bible. He was a student of JND. As a young man, he sat under his ministry.
Yeah.
And I've heard, I forgot where did I read this, that, Scofield had Darby's synopsis right on his desk in his hand when he was working on his Bible. It's not that far removed, and as I think that Crawford suggests a little bit. But it's really, the difference comes down like in the systematization of like the dispensations and how they're laid out and that type of thing. To me, which is kind of a minor thing in a way.
The dispensations are a minor thing in dispensationalism.
Yeah. Because the big thing is the distinction between Israel and the church.
Yeah.
And where the and how you arrange dispensations, it can be a little subjective, but the current batch of dispensationalists, I would say, are decidedly different from Darby. Like if you read Mike Vlach's books, for example, and he has a lot of good stuff. I'm not being critical. I want to be very Canadian about it, right?
Mike Vlach, you're ruining Darby's legacy.
No, but he, like in his book on dispensationalism, like the essentials, how to understand it. It's a good book overall, but he says you can take out the rapture and still have dispensationalism. Really? Like to me, it's the whole thing. It's the fact that the church is this body, the joint heirs of Christ that are being called out of the nations, while the times and seasons, God's dealings with the nations and with Israel and with the earth are in abeyance, like the clock has stopped. He's calling out Christ's co-heirs who will reign with him. When he's revealed in glory, will be revealed with him. We're his the heirs of God, the joint heirs with Christ, and this imminent hope of the Lord's return. That's the whole, and the distinction between us and Israel. That's the whole thing, right? And in his book, New Creation Model, he basically charges JND with Platonism, like Augustinianism and dualism and all this. But I disagree with it, actually. And it is, I may be wrong in my disagreement. Maybe he's right. But to the point, it is totally different from JND, right? So Crawford is right in that, but I think with the bulk of dispensationalism, it, up until say Louis Sperry Schaeffer and so on, that era is really hardly any difference. Like I think Crawford quotes the Concise Bible Dictionary, was written by some brethren who wrote it after Darby died, but probably in the early 1900s. They give like three main dispensations, dispensation of the law, dispensation of grace, and then the millennium as the three main dispensations. But like if you take, here's volume 1 of Darby's collected writings. The article is called The Apostasy of the Successive Dispensations, typical Darby title, right? But he says, here dispensations begin, properly speaking. Though he's speaking there of Noah, like the period of Noah. And then he has the dispensation of the law, the two tables of the testimony of the law begins another. And then he has here the kingly dispensation. And then he goes on to speak. So in every dispensation, but this was, and so on. Like, so sometimes he'll call it dispensation, sometimes an age. So see, JND himself wasn't clear, because I've read his 34 volumes. Like he was not a systematizer, right? He just wrote, and some people find that frustrating. But he said, Darby said, I'm like a miner, I bring up the ore. And let others, melt it down and circulate it. Go ahead.
Do you think there's maybe a benefit to being a miner, as in, like, maybe that's just what all we should be doing?
Yeah.
Maybe the whole systematizing, maybe we're all just taking it a step too far.
Yeah, because, ultimately we get the glory. hey, Lord, my dispensational chart isn't quite matching what this right? Right. But the truth that did come out, I really believe fundamentally was given by the Spirit of God. Okay. And I have no doubt about that. And, as far as the details, we can, quibble about this and that. And yeah, you're right that Darby himself, he dreaded systematization. And so that really comes through in his writings. But so I just recommend read his 34-volume set of the collected writings if you can handle it. And but I do recommend his letters. Okay. Absolutely. 3 volumes. Each one is over 300 pages. And it's a wealth of information. I mean, you would disagree probably with some of his things, his high Calvinism, his paedo-baptism. You would have to sort of swallow that or jump over that. But there's a lot of really, really good teaching and interactions with other Christians, and the atmosphere, of the development of the recovery of this truth and so on. Really, really helpful.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, for your time and for all of your wisdom and insight on JN Darby. It's sort of a far-reaching conversation hitting on a lot of things, but the new biography that's out is Becoming JND by Max Weremchuk. Encourage you to read it. It's a fascinating read to go through. There's also Crawford Gribben's new book, Roots of Dispensationalism. I have that one too.
I recommend it.
And Brian recommends both of them. And then your other recommendation is to read his the 3 volumes of Darby's letters. Do you know where you can pick that up today? Is that at Bible Truth Publishers?
Bible Truth Publishers in Illinois, you can get it there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we'll put a link down to go to their site to hopefully track that one down. But thank you so much for watching. And if you are new to Rev Reads, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel and keep looking and join us back for our next reviews.